Hey everyone, welcome back. Over the next couple of days, we're looking at classical medicine in Greece and Rome with a focus on diet and health. And the foundations that we see develop in ancient Greece and Rome really are the foundations for diet and medicine through the Middle Ages, through the Renaissance, well into the early modern period and well into the 1800s. So what we're looking at now, even though we're centered around ancient Greece and Rome, sort of 400 BC through 200 AD, roughly, seems like forever ago, but really that was the foundation of Western medicine for a long, long time, especially in terms of diet and dietary advice. So we're really looking at the origins here. What's so great about classical medicine in Greece and Rome? Why are we starting there? Why are we going all the way back? It seems like a completely different world, and it was. The reason it's so important for Western medicine is it's the advent of what we now call rational medicine, which is systematically thinking through the causation between disease and symptoms and health. And this idea of rational medicine is often associated with this shadowy figure called Hippocrates, who we don't have a lot of information about as an individual, often referred to as the father of medicine. Physicians now, when they graduate from medical school, take the Hippocratic Oath still. We don't know too much about him as a historical figure. He lived around 400 BC, so it's a long time ago. A lot of things have been lost, needless to say. We're not even sure he wrote all the books that people ascribe to him. So we tend to talk in terms of a Hippocratic tradition or Hippocratic corpus. Corpus means body, so body of work, a set of texts. And whether he wrote them or not is sort of irrelevant. But the one thing that kind of unifies them is that they're focused on rational medicine, which posits that when you get sick, there's a cause. There's a rational, natural cause that can be understood. And this marked a very significant shift in attributing to disease from divine punishment or some sort of magical spell or something. In our world, we think of magic and folklore and superstition as really kind of divorced from science and reality and so on. But in the ancient world, folklore, magic, superstition, divinity, supernatural influences on the world were much more sort of part of general culture than they are today. And so it made sense that many people would see a disease, especially something like epilepsy, which was called the sacred disease, because it was thought to have the supernatural origin and didn't in fact come from rational natural causes. And Hippocrates and sort of the school of thought around Hippocrates in terms of medicine was insistent that all diseases, right? Even the sacred disease. Every disease has a definitive natural cause that we can investigate systematically. We can write it down. We can learn about it over time. We can study it in different people. And it may have different symptoms and there may be variations, but there's a common sort of underlying core to different kinds of diseases. And we can learn it. We can systematize it. We can treat it consistently and effectively. And it may seem weird that that has to be invented, but when you think about it, of course it does. Because when you look at the natural world, everything is changing, right? People, every time you get a cold, you kind of know what's going to happen, right? But they're all a little different, right? Different people experiences the same disease in completely different ways sometimes. So it's not at all obvious when you're just looking around and you see all these variations that things are actually very systematized and there's a sort of a unifying force behind them. When we're talking about classical medicine, there's no ideas of germs, of course. They think disease was caused by other factors that we'll get into in a second. But the key development in ancient Greece in terms of medicine is this idea of rational medicine, that you can understand what's going on. So that's the Hippocratic contributions. And he writes about epidemics, he writes about airs, waters, and places. He's trying to understand medicine in this very holistic way, in a very sort of systematic way. And the physician Galen, who we're reading about for today, we're reading his text and introduction to him. He systematized medicine in a way that was just absolutely unheard of at the time, and in a way is almost unbelievable even today. Like the amount of work he produced, the amount of books he wrote, the amount of knowledge he synthesized, the amount of medical authorities he quoted in his sources is absolutely tremendous. And just like Hippocrates, probably things have been ascribed to Galen that somebody else wrote, but it's so similar to what he thought that he kind of gets credit for some stuff that maybe he didn't do. Doesn't matter. The exact attributions really don't matter. But we want to learn about this figure who was a central pillar of Western medicine for a long, long time. Grant, in his introduction to Galen that you'll read for today, gives a good introduction to him and his context and his time. So I'll leave that for the reading. A few highlights, though, might be helpful. So Galen lived and practiced at the height of the Roman Empire. He died around 215 or something like that. Not many individuals can claim to have affected history and culture for 1500 years. And Galen absolutely can. I mean, his name is in every medical text up until the 1800s, like every single one. It's amazing. He becomes the voice of Hippocrates. And if you know anything about philosophy, you know that Plato was kind of the voice of Socrates. And we find the parallel to that in medicine as well. Galen is kind of the spokesperson for Hippocratic medicine. And he references a lot of Hippocratic writings, and he takes them kind of to the next level in how he's synthesizing lots of different medical opinions from around ancient Rome. He was a highly successful, unusually successful physician, treating patients from social elites, including Emperor Marcus Aurelius. So the takeaway here is Galen is highly exceptional. Okay, he's not representative of medical practice in ancient Rome, but he tells us so much about medical practice that we really wouldn't understand much without him. One of the things we learn about in the introduction to Galen is that he was widely traveled, and he did this on purpose. Why would a physician be so interested in travel? You learn local customs, you learn folk wisdom, you learn how different climates, microclimates affect people, how people respond to different kinds of diseases. You learn what different plants they have to produce medicinal effects. You learn what kind of foods they eat and what kind of diet produces different kinds of temperaments and affects the different kind of people and health, right? So he's able to synthesize and systematize all this different knowledge he gains from all these different places, traveling around the Mediterranean. He was also a physician to a gladiatorial school in Pergamum, which is in Western Turkey. He learned a lot about anatomy, seeing gladiators get ripped apart by lions or whatever. And he gets to see inside the body, which otherwise you couldn't do. And this was super important for Galen because he took a very holistic approach to medicine. And he wanted to think about drugs and food and diet and anatomy and physiology and sort of the seasons and climate. And he wanted to see how all these things work together to create health or disease in the body. And so anatomical knowledge, it seems like it's kind of irrelevant to diet, but it is absolutely central for him to understand how everything worked together in terms of a holistic view of health. So Galen was an exception to the rule of what the average physician was like. So let's say a word about that. Physicians in the classical world and through the medieval and even the early modern worlds, this starts to change over time, but they were seen as craftsmen. They were seen as a skilled worker, like a bricklayer, right? Somebody who has a skill at a certain thing. If you need their services, you pay them and they do a thing. They tell you what drug to take. They give you a remedy. They tell you what disease you have and how you can deal with it. But physicians did not have this cultural elite status that we now ascribe to them. And the physicians, classical physicians certainly had more medical knowledge than the average person. But they had for the most part, a very particular and personal view of medicine. It was very local. If you wanted to be a physician, you followed your uncle or somebody else who practiced medicine. You learned from different patients. You learned from your experience. Many physicians, most were probably illiterate. There's a few features of classical medicine that we can see in Galen's writing that we'll look at for today. One, there's no credentialing. There's no doctor's license that you can get. There's no medical school that you can go to. Becoming a physician was like becoming a house builder. You learned from people who knew more than you. You kept practicing, you learned different techniques. You might travel around and see how they build in different places. So how do you get patients? Well, you treat people and you have success. You actually learn something that's going to be effective. And certainly there were physicians who weren't very effective, and some were very effective, like Galen. But you have to develop a reputation. You have to tell people that you're good at something. You have to have success stories, right? You have to be able to show, and you have to be able to talk about your experience and your knowledge in order to get people to trust you. Galen excelled at all these, like more than most people. Another feature of classical medicine is that there's a distinct lack of standardization of medical knowledge. We tend to think of medicine now as, doctors in China, doctors in the US, doctors in South Africa. They're all kind of doing similar things, right? Different cultures, but medical knowledge, we think of it as kind of universal. But in the classical world, there was a lot of disagreement about how medicine should be practiced, about what kind of treatment you should provide, what different diseases were, how you should classify different kinds of diseases. And one of the things that Galen did is try to bring this all together and reconcile these differences and present a more unified system of medical knowledge. We'll see him doing this in his writing on food for today. So let me share my screen here and I'll go into my usual spot in the corner. Okay, here we are. Here's the title page, Galen on Food and Diet. There's a section here called On the Humors, and I just want to highlight a couple things here because this is the basis for how medicine worked in the classical world, and in fact worked through the 1800s until we have really kind of the medical system we have now. Air, fire, water, and earth, the four elements. Everything in the world is made up out of these. And this seems very crude and simplistic, but when you think about it, it's very general on purpose so that you can combine it. You can combine these elements in any way, right? All human bodies, books, everything, paper. It's a really powerful and flexible system. So these four elements make up everything. They have four qualities to them: hot, cold, wet, dry, which we'll see in a second. The four humors: black bile, blood, phlegm, and yellow bile. All of these things were intertwined, right? The four humors were made up the four elements. They had the four qualities. And as you wouldn't be surprised to know that balance is what keeps everything sort of in health. These four humors and these four qualities and these four elements seem like, how can you possibly explain anything with that? But Galen explains it. If you look at this passage here, when we make proper use of foods and recipes, the attendant humors follow, right? So when we eat the right foods, we get the right humors, and having the right balance of humors, not equal amounts of each one. Every person has their own temperament, which means different balance of things, different amounts of things. But when you eat the right foods for your body, this is kind of like an early blood type diet, I suppose. When you eat the right foods for your temperament, you'll be healthy. And if you don't, you get out of balance, you get sick. These four elements, the four qualities, the four humors also explain things like aging, right? The blood increases at puberty, hence teenagers are cheerful and enthusiastically disposed to games, right? They have a lot of energy, they have a lot of blood. But yellow bile in adolescence makes for anger, sexual drive, and bullying early in the stage of life. In old age, there's phlegm, right? Old people are cold and kind of drippy. There's a sluggishness, loss of memory, lethargy. This is because old age is moist and cold, right? Unlike the prime of life, which is dry and cold, right? Wet things are kind of slow and sluggish and kind of not as vibrant. Okay, so he's using these elements, using the humors to explain everything around him, everything in terms of health. Okay, you can get really nuanced with this, okay? But all we need to think about is there's four humors in the body. They have to be balanced. Everyone's got their own kind of balance amongst them, and that is health. When they're in balance, when they're out of balance, you get dis-ease. Galen's very interested in the cause of disease, right? That's his probably main focus in his medical writings. Where do we get disease? How do we fix it? Diseases occur at this passage here when the humors decrease or increase contrary to what is usual in terms of quality, quantity, shifting of positions. When they get out of balance, you get sick. And this is very unlike the modern pharmaceutical industry, which is very happy to ignore causes, right? They just want to treat symptoms because the symptoms never go away, right? But a real physician, according to Galen, according to Hippocrates, is going to treat the cause. All the green references are to Hippocrates. You see how often Hippocrates shows up in Galen's writing. He references a lot of different authorities, often to contradict them, but Hippocrates is always on this kind of pedestal of like he is the almost divine father of medicine. And so Galen is building his expertise by referencing all the things that Hippocrates said, right? He knows everything Hippocrates said. Plus, he knows everything that everybody says, and he's going to tell you why he's right. Galen is really good at that. Let's go to the powers of foods. Again, a little bit of highlighting. Again, the particular passages here, I think they're revealing, but there's nothing special about these exact words. It's really the category of thing that I want you to pay attention to. The first line, I think, is super revealing here. A considerable number of the most outstanding physicians have written about the powers of foods, yet have set down their ideas in a great deal of haste, even though it's the most important of medical subjects. So one of the things he's doing in this text is trying to consolidate all of this knowledge that people have written down. And he's outlining a method for acquiring medical knowledge, right? Lots of people write things down, but what's the proof? What's the evidence, right? So he's trying to explain to his readers, you have to have a lot of different opinions. You have to have a lot of evidence. One person isn't really sufficient for medical knowledge. So in this passage here on the facing page, this is what Diocles said when he became convinced he could understand the powers of foods in just one experiment. You can't learn medicine just from a little bit of experience. You have to have a theory about how things work. You have to understand the humors and the temperaments, hot, cold, wet, dry. You have to understand the elements, earth, air, fire, water. You have to understand how these things work in theory in order to understand medicine. I will state my definitions carefully. This is my usual method. I'm not going to abandon it now. He's constantly telling us what his method is because he wants us to trust him. This is a way he was establishing expertise. Here's how I learn about medicine. It's better than everyone else's way. You should trust me. Another yellow highlight talking about Hippocrates in food medicine, right? That's a famous quote, right? Let food be thy medicine is the kind of more contemporary version we hear. But food is medicine. When you're sick, it's because your humors are out of their natural proportions. You eat the food that's going to restore them, right? If you have too much blood feeling anxious, you need to eat calming foods, right? You need to eat things that are going to restore that balance. Galen goes on to talk about the basics of diet here. The human body, if the human body is average in temperament, you need to eat a diet that's average in temperament. If you're a really spicy, saucy person, you should be eating chilies all the time, right? If you're very mellow, you don't want super spicy foods, right? That's going to upset your temperament. But we also have to keep in mind that there's no absolute powers to foods. It's all relative to the individual, which is something that at times gets lost in modern medical advice. In fact, this is one of my favorite quotes in the whole book. In fact, just recently, two people were having an argument about whether honey was healthy. I'm sure you could find two people today who would argue about whether honey is healthy, right? It spikes your glycemic index. The other person says this is a natural thing. It's totally fine. He's talking about these two physicians offering proof that they had seen honey help someone or hurt someone, but ignoring the fact that not everyone has the same temperament. Honey is a valuable food for some people, and it's not a valuable food for other people. There are times in your life where honey would be helpful. There's times when it would not be helpful. Okay. You have to match it to what's going on. There's no absolute definition of healthy, right? In some ways, Galen understood diet and health far better than people do today. So Galen in this red passage here is talking about treating a patient. And the patient was distressed that this food that he had been eating suddenly was causing him trouble and he didn't feel good. And Galen swooped in and immediately recognized the issue, which was that the person's body was in a different state. The patient's body was in a different state. He was eating a certain food. It was useful at the time. The patient's body changed, right, for whatever the circumstances was. And that food that was beneficial was no longer beneficial. In fact, it was harmful. And so Galen is, again, using his experience to explain to this patient that just because something was good for you at one point doesn't mean it's always going to be good for you. There's this relativism about what constitutes a healthy food, right? It depends on the patient, depends on their particular constitution, their temperament, whether they're diseased or not, whether they're healthy or not. And this idea of Galen relating his own experience and trying to get people to trust him and establishing his expertise by telling stories about treating patients. This is a common trope in the Western medical tradition in terms of diet that we see all the time. Even now, you can go into any bookstore, pull off a random book about diet, and there's going to be some anecdotal story at the beginning about, I was sick, I did this, and then I got better. Or I saw a patient and they didn't know what was going on, so I did this and they got better. There's always this personal experience, right? Galen sort of invented that almost, constantly promoting his own successes. And in fact, you can see in the green sections here, again, I'm not going to read all these little bits to you, but you should look out for this when you're reading it for yourself. All the different ways he's talking about experience, the different ways he's talking about other medical authorities and trying to consolidate their knowledge and explain why one person has it right and one person doesn't, or everybody's wrong and he's going to give you the right answer. And this last little green bit here is really a kind of a perfect encapsulation of what Galen's about. Books are memorials to erstwhile scholars, not perfect training manuals for the ignorant. If you want to be good at medicine, you can't just read things. You have to go practice. You have to apply it to different cases. You have to learn from lots of different people in lots of different places. And it's this combination of theory and practice. It's this combination of experience and book learning that he's going to bring together for us. And he's going to do this in terms of diet, right? He's going to tell us about all these foodstuffs, all these different ingredients, all these different kinds of foods, the different properties, when they'd be useful, when they'd be harmful, things you have to look out for, right? He's very concerned about blockages. Don't eat things that stop up the body. You have to keep the juices flowing, otherwise you get sick. And one last quote I want to call your attention to before we sign off here. The best breads are those that are baked under a dome. Now, any bakers in the audience, anyone who got into the sourdough craze during COVID knows that putting a pan of water in your stove at the bottom to create more humidity, or baking your bread in a Dutch oven, meaning like a cast iron pan with a lid, you get a better crust. And the reason is it creates humidity so that it doesn't dry out the crust, right? So it gets hard, it gets crunchy, it gets flavorful without drying out and becoming gross. Galen knew this 2,000 years ago. The best breads are those baked under a dome, but he's not talking about flavor. He's not talking about crunchy crust. He's talking about cooking the bread carefully. You don't cook it in a dome, like if you just grill it or put it in an oven, the breads are altogether bad because their crust is overcooked and their crumb is undercooked, right? Foods have to be cooked in the right way. And every food has kind of a different way that needs to be cooked because it's going to be better absorbed by the body. It's going to be better assimilated. Okay, that's enough of that. Again, those particular passages, it's just an example of the kind of thing I hope you keep in mind as you're reading through Galen's text. There's a lot of detail in there, so it can be hard to parse out what's really important. So I'm trying to highlight the kinds of things that are important. So I want you to keep an eye out for how foods are used to control health. It is the preeminent way classical physicians and medieval and early modern physicians would try to keep a patient healthy is through food, right? Medicine, drugs, things that change the body. That was a far second, right? Surgery was absolute last resort. So foods are essential to control health. You get a sense of how that worked theoretically. Galen's constantly making a case for his own expertise, right? How does he acquire that? Lots of experience, lots of patience, lots of reading different physicians, lots of traveling, lots of different experiences. He's constantly displaying his own awareness of lots of different medical opinions, right? Because knowing what all the other physicians have thought, reconciling them when they disagree, showing why people don't have enough evidence or their argument doesn't make sense. He's trying to engage with everything he can, with all the knowledge he can find. And he's coupling that textual knowledge, like what's written down, with experience, right? And it's this coupling that's so important. He's constantly explaining his own methods for acquiring medical knowledge and developing his expertise. And this is why we should trust him, right? He has a more thorough, more comprehensive method than anyone else, right? Other people can give you their opinions, but they don't have the same breadth of learning. They don't have the same experience. So this building up of expertise is something, his own expertise, getting people to trust him, the rhetoric of diet and health is something that we see throughout pre-modern medicine and into modern medicine as well, although it kind of gets replaced by the language of science. This is the kind of thing I want us to be thinking about as we read lots of different historical texts about diet, is how the author gets us to believe them and how that changes over time. You see all the different ways that Galen's doing it here, and we'll see how people continue that forward in different ways, in different cultures, in different medical climates, and so on. That's it. See you in the next one. And don't forget about the groats.